Good morning, everyone. My name's Amanda. I'm just hosting this workshop on behalf of our presenters here. So you are in serving immigrant survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. The workshop is 8:45 until 10:15 this morning. And just to introduce you to our workshop presenters, we have Sarah Martin-Torres. She is the State Liaison for Immigrant Survivors Project at the Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center. She holds a master's degree in social work from Temple University and has been providing immigration legal services to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking for nearly a decade as a Department of Justice accredited representative. Also with us is Carla M. Rios Orengo. She is a legal advocate for the Immigrant Survivors Project at the Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center and holds a Juris Doctor degree from, pardon me if I butcher the name, Pontifical Catholic University of Puerto Rico School of Law. She is passionate about access to justice and equal application of the law, which led her to provide legal services to immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, leveraging the protections allowed in the law of humanitarian relief as a Department of Justice accredited representative. At this time, I'll hand the workshop over to Sarah and Carla.
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on serving immigrant survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. We are glad to be here with you all this morning. I'm going to start by just introducing PERC for those of you who may not be familiar with us. And as I'm introducing PERC, if you'd like, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Just drop in your name and what program you are from, program or agency you're from, so we can have a bit of an idea of who we're talking to this morning. So the Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center is an immigration legal service nonprofit. We are based in York, and we have 2 satellite offices now, one in Pittsburgh and one in Allentown. And we are actually celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. So we've been around for a little while now, and we have 2 main program areas. We have our removal defense program, which, as its name suggests, focuses on folks who are detained or in immigration detention, or they're in detention or they're in removal, so in deportation proceedings. So that project does a couple of different things. They do some bond work. They are part of a universal representation pilot. So they do some direct representation, and they also provide legal orientation to folks who are detained, kind of orienting them to the process of to the immigration courts and the deportation and removal process, and help them identify if they have any defense to deportation. We also have our community programs, which is comprised of our naturalization project, where we help folks apply for U.S. citizenship. And we also have our Immigrant Survivors Project, which is the project that Carla and I both work for, which has been around for just over 10 years now. And is primarily VOCA funded. And what we do is provide free immigration legal services to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. The project has always provided immigration legal services in close partnership with domestic violence and sexual assault programs. So in the past, we used to just serve South Central Pennsylvania, like a 9-county region around York. In 2018, we received funding to expand our services and become statewide. And so in order to keep that close partnership with domestic violence and sexual assault agencies, we launched the Immigrant Survivors Advocate Network, which trying to see if there's anyone on here from an ESON agency. Yeah, I see someone from Voice. And Victim Service Center in Montgomery County. So those are 2 agencies that are participating. We have about 37 programs participating, and basically ESON member agencies are able to make referrals to us for immigration legal services for their clients. They also receive no-cost translation, document translation, and telephonic and video interpretation. They also receive training and technical assistance, and we also have a resource bank that provides a whole bunch of resources that are relevant to serving immigrant survivors. If your agency, and I see also Women's Center of Beaver County, who is also an ESON member, if you are from a DBSA agency that is not currently participating in the network and you want more information, please feel free to email me afterwards. Our emails will be at the end of the PowerPoint. And what I did want to make a note and apologize about our PowerPoint. We had a little bit of a glitch this morning and we weren't able to get it to share full screen. So that's why you see it in this view. But we hope you'll still be able to read everything and see everything. And it is, the PowerPoint is also available in the resources out in the lobby. If you click on workshop resources and select our workshop, you'll find it there too. So yeah, so that's PERC, that's ISP and what we do. And Carla, if you want to go to the next slide. This is what we hope to cover this morning in the time that we have with you. We're hoping that by the end of this presentation, you will have a better understanding of the role that someone's immigration status may play in their experience with domestic violence and sexual assault. You'll be familiar with the immigration options that are available to survivors and know how to make a referral for free immigration legal assistance. And we hope that you'll also be able to look at your own organization and think about ways that you might be able to, some steps you might be able to take to make your services more accessible, more responsive to the unique needs of immigrant survivors. So I did also want to mention, please feel free to use the chat. We'll keep an eye on it throughout the presentation. I will hope that at some point we might get some interaction from you all in the chat, so we're not just talking at you for the next 90 minutes. So feel free, you can use the Q&A icon on the left if you have a question, or you can also just type your question into the chat. We'll monitor both. So please feel free to ask any questions or share any comments there. Okay, so we're going to start out by talking about a little bit about how immigrant survivors may experience domestic violence and sexual assault a little bit differently than their US-born counterparts. And to do that, we're going to use a domestic violence hypo, kind of a case study. And so in this first section of the hypo, what I want you to listen for is how Asha's immigration status is used against her, or is kind of used as a tool of abuse, or how her immigration status factors into her experience. This is Asha. She was born in Lahore, Pakistan, and was the third of 5 children. Her father passed away when she was 12 years old, and she attended school until the 6th grade and then worked in the home with her mother. When she was 19 years old, her uncle came to her mother and brother and said that he knew of a good man for Asha to marry. Asha's uncle and brother met with her future husband and his family and decided that they would be married. Asha spoke to her husband, to her future husband, a few times by phone and learned that he was a U.S. citizen and that she would be coming to join him and live with him and his family here in Pennsylvania. She entered the United States several months later on a fiancé visa. She felt nervous to leave her family and her home and to live in a country that she'd never been to before, but her friends and family assured her that she would soon grow to love her husband. They were married 2 months after she arrived, but her husband never filed for her permanent residency, and her fiancé visa expired after 90 days, leaving her without legal immigration status. Shortly after she arrived, Asha's husband took her wedding ring, her wedding jewelry, her passport, birth certificate, and locked them in a desk drawer. He constantly made threats to, I apologize. He constantly made threats to have her deported, and she was not able to leave the house without her husband's permission and never tried to, because he told her that she would be arrested for being in the country illegally. She could not speak any English, and her husband would not allow her to take English classes, telling her, "You don't need English. You don't need to speak English to stay at home cooking and cleaning. She had no access to money and could only call her family when her husband allowed her to. He listened to every call to be sure that she did not tell her family members what was happening. So if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat any kind of tools of abuse that you heard in Asha's story, or how her immigration status was kind of used against her. Great. So I see someone saying would not permit her to learn English. Somebody else mentioned the language barrier. That's great. Her PERP was able to coerce and control her, letting her visa expire, locking her documents away from access isolation. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Carla, if you want to go ahead, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So you guys got a number of these, which is great. The first one, which you all did mention, is the isolation piece. And so he did try to isolate her in a number of ways, right? One of which was with the language piece. So not letting her learn English. She wasn't able to communicate with anyone here in the United States. She was really isolated by language, and she was also just really physically isolated. In this case, this is a real case of mine. Later on, when she goes to a neighbor for help, the neighbor actually had no idea who she was. He didn't even know that this man had a wife, because she was so isolated. She was really kind of locked away in this home, and never left, never went out. So there was a ton of isolation. He also tried to, if you remember, cut her off from her friends and family, not letting her, controlling her access to communication with them, listening in on phone conversations so she couldn't disclose what was going on. So tons of isolation in this case. He also withheld her identity documents, which is something that we see really commonly with immigrant survivors. In this case, where it's a mixed status relationship, but also even when it's not, and even when both parties are undocumented, we often see that abusers will withhold identity documents or destroy identity documents, particularly immigration related documents. Like, I've had many clients who have had their green card cut up, they've had their passport ripped up, or even, burned, or just kept away from them. And that's really difficult for immigrant survivors, because it's so hard. If someone destroys your birth certificate, it may be one of the only forms of identification that you have, and can be really costly and really time consuming to replace them, from here in the United States. And it's extra important for us as advocates to be aware of that, because, when you're doing safety planning with an immigrant survivor, that's something that you'll want to address. It might not be something that you do with everyone, but you might want to talk through, where are your identity documents? Is there a way that we can keep those safe? Either at least keeping copies, maybe they're in your office, or if they can keep them with someone, a trusted friend or a family member, to keep those documents safe. A really big tool of abuse that we heard in Asha's story was his failing to file an immigration application on her behalf. And so this is, of course, most relevant for mixed status relationships, where the abuser may be a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident, and they have the ability to file for their spouse. We're going to talk about, some of the options that Asha might have when I turn it over to Carla, but you can see how this could really be used as a means of power and control, right? To keep someone in a relationship by saying, you need me to file for you. If you call the police, I'm not going to file for you. They also you might see where they actually do file, and then they continue to use that and hold it over the survivor's head as a means of control, like, saying, I'm going to sabotage the interview, I won't go to the interview, or I'll tell immigration that this is all a fraud, and that you only are, that this is a fraudulent marriage. We see that a lot with survivors. So a lot of ways that abusers use the immigration system itself as a tool of abuse. We also heard in Asha's story threats around deportation, threatening to get someone sent back. That happens in, I'd say, the majority of my cases. In reality, it's very unlikely that an abuser saying, I'm going to call ICE, I'm going to get you deported. It's very unlikely that ICE is going to respond when an abuser is calling about, one single person and probably, someone who has no criminal history. I've never seen ICE take action in a case like that. But for the survivor, you can see how that would be very frightening and again, a really powerful way to control someone. It didn't come up, I don't think I mentioned it particularly in the Hypo, but it is part of Asha's story, that there was also in this case a lot of abuse from the in-laws. And I just mention it as something to be aware of. When you're checking in with someone about their living situation. In this case, the in-laws were super controlling, which you'll hear in the second part of the Hypo, but just something to flag. We also often see abusers lying about the police and lying about services in the United States, specifically telling survivors that they don't have access to those services, that no one will help you, you're not a citizen, or you don't have a social security number, so you can't access these things. If you call the police, they're going to arrest you and deport you. I'm a citizen, you're not. So for many survivors, they may believe, particularly in a mixed status relationship like Asha's, where he's a US citizen, he's been living here in the United States, she's going to believe what he says about the United States because he obviously, may be more familiar with the systems here than she is. We also often see threats to harm the family in the home country. And this can be a really scary situation for survivors. You have so little control over what's happening, so far away. And of course, they don't want to put their family members in jeopardy. So that's something that we see often. And then finally, another one that we heard in Asha's case was, using financial abuse, not giving access to money, which is especially true for immigrant survivors often because they may not have work authorization, so they couldn't work here legally if they wanted to, and they may also not have access to the safety net of public benefits that's available to US born survivors. So I'm going to continue with the second part. Sorry, I'm looking because I think I have a bit of a mix up on my slides, but Carla, if you could just go back to the previous slide for now. I apologize for that. Okay, so in the second section of Asha's story, what I want you to listen for are some of the barriers that Asha faces, some of the things that make it difficult for her to seek help. Okay, so the physical and sexual violence continued to get worse as months passed and Asha did not become pregnant. Eventually, at her mother-in-law's insistence, they took her to a doctor. At the doctor's office, Asha's mother-in-law interpreted for her so she could not disclose the abuse or ask for help. Then, after an incident where her husband twisted her arm behind her back, slammed her into the wall, and threatened to kill her, Asha ran out of the house to a neighbor, fearing for her life. She was not able to communicate with them, but they knew she was in trouble and called 911. The responding officer did not speak Urdu and asked Asha's father-in-law to interpret for her. There were no visible marks on her, and her husband was not arrested, but the officer asked if there was somewhere else that Asha could stay for the evening. The family arranged for her to stay with another family from their mosque, and while she was there, she was able to make contact with a cousin in California who got online and looked up the local domestic violence program and called their hotline. She worked with an advocate to make arrangements for Asha to go into shelter. In shelter, Asha couldn't communicate with staff or other shelter guests. She'd never been in a shelter before and wasn't even really familiar with the concept, as she'd never heard of one in Pakistan. It was extremely difficult, but she was eventually able to tell her story through a telephonic interpreter. Advocates helped her file for a PFA, which was ultimately granted. And she was not yet authorized to work in the United States and could not qualify for any public benefits. Her husband and his family immediately began spreading rumors around her community in Pakistan that she had left her husband for another man, bringing a tremendous amount of shame to her family. Asha became depressed, but couldn't access individual or group counseling because although she'd begun to take English classes, her English was still pretty limited. So if you guys want to drop in the chat any of the barriers that you heard in that second piece. Great. A lot of language barriers. Yeah. So there were a couple of opportunities, right, where there were these points of intervention. There was an interaction with the police. There was also an interaction at the doctor's office. Oh, I'm sorry, Carla, you can go to that, to the next slide. So there were these points of intervention, but unfortunately, those agencies didn't do a great job in terms of language access, and they both used really inappropriate interpreters. And that's something that we unfortunately see pretty frequently. You know, I've seen cases where they've asked the abuser themselves to interpret for the victim. I've seen cases where they've asked, you know, like a 9-year-old child to interpret for the victim. And, you know, sometimes I understand when it's like a true emergency situation and you know, time of the essence, but often we see failures around language access, even when it's not particularly time sensitive or really an urgent situation, just because, you know, it does take a bit of extra time and sometimes can be, you know, it costs money, and you have to have those systems in place ahead of time to really do a good job in terms of language access. But so language is a huge barrier. And she also experienced a language barrier, if you remember, when she got into the DV shelter, where she wasn't able to communicate with folks until they got a telephone interpreter on the line for her. We talked about isolation earlier on, and again, that was another barrier here. Like I said, when she ran to that neighbor, they didn't even know who she was. Fortunately, they did still contact 911 on her behalf. But she didn't have, you know, she didn't have anyone here. She had one distant cousin in California, who is ultimately who she did go to for help. But she just didn't have the network here that others who have maybe lived here, you know, all their life might have. Another big barrier that we often see that maybe doesn't come out so much in Asha's story, but is this distrust in the police. And immigrant survivors may have distrust in the police for a number of different reasons. They may have had negative experiences with law enforcement in their home country. You know, maybe they themselves or they saw friends or family or community members try to report domestic or sexual violence and have it not taken seriously. They may have experienced abuse at the hands of law enforcement or immigration authorities, perhaps like on their journey to the US. So, and then they may have had, you know, negative experiences here in the US with law enforcement. And they also have this kind of, I'll tell one quick story of someone who, you know, who had those experiences. I remember working with a woman from Colombia who experienced really severe domestic violence involving firearms, knives. I think she was, you know, pregnant at the time and pretty far along. And she finally got the courage. She called the police and they came to her house. They took her abuser outside. You know, a few minutes later, he was back inside and he was basically laughing at her, like, because he was a paramilitary, he was very wealthy. He just paid off the police officer. And so he thought it was hilarious that she thought she could call the police on him. And he was like, you know, you can call police on me. I can buy them. It doesn't matter. I remember another woman who her husband was part of the ruling party. I think she was from Mozambique, but you know, again, really severe domestic violence, and she would go to the police station physically and report it, and they could see the injuries on her, and they would actually like physically bring her back to her husband, who would then become even more severely abusive because she had tried to make this report. So people come with those experiences, and it's understandable why they may not view the police as a resource here in the U.S. And then you couple that with the fear of immigration enforcement that many survivors have, because they may not understand that there is actually a separation between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities. They may have the perception that there is, or there may actually be real cooperation between those two agencies. And so if they think that by calling the police, they're going to be asked about their immigration status and they may end up in removal proceedings themselves, obviously, excuse me, that's a huge deterrent to contacting the police. And that is true. I remember doing this, I mean, it's been a number of years now, but I remember surveying clients about that. And even clients who had their green card, so legal, lawful permanent residents who are, you know, very, very secure immigration status, they still, even those folks reported delaying contacting the police or not contacting the police at all because they had this fear of immigration enforcement. So you can imagine how that's even more amplified for someone who is undocumented and, you know, is hearing the rhetoric, you know, that's been going around for many, many years now. Another barrier that often comes up is a lack of understanding of the U.S. Legal systems. You know, this is true for U.S. born survivors, right? Like, you're in crisis, you're going through something traumatic, and you're trying to navigate these systems that you may not be familiar with, like, you know, criminal cases or PFA proceedings. It's hard, right? And so for someone who may not even be from this country, who may not speak, this might not be their first language, you can imagine how that's even more challenging. And sometimes there's even you know, there's differences in the actual laws. So there may be, they may come from a country where there aren't even domestic violence laws on the books. It could be, you know, in some countries, in some places, assault is defined as putting your hands on anyone who is not your wife. So it is permissible to physically assault your wife. A big one that I've often run into is around a big misperception, I'd say, is around marital rape. So not having the understanding that you know, that you could say no to your husband, and so that, you know, there is such a thing as marital rape here in the United States. And these are important for us to know as advocates, because we can, I see someone saying this is where the advocate plays a major role, and that's so true, because it's really our job to do that education and to talk that through with the survivor. Of course, it's going to be up to them, you know, what they want to do, if they want to make a report or not, and follow through with cooperating or not. But it's our job to make sure that they have that understanding of what their rights are here in the U.S. and what the laws are here in the U.S. I saw someone also mention in the chat cultural barriers, and absolutely that's the case. In Asha's case, one factor was, you know, he really started spreading these rumors about her back in her community in Pakistan, saying, you know, that she had left him for another man. It was really, which was one of the most upsetting parts for her. You know, even despite all the physical and sexual abuse that there was, one of the things that she was most upset about was these rumors that he was spreading, because it was embarrassing to her, and it was embarrassing to her family. So something to keep an eye on. We talked a little bit about financial concerns. We know that for many domestic violence survivors, the financial piece is one reason that people often feel that they're compelled to stay, because they may be worried that they won't be able to support themselves or support their children without their abusive partner. And that's also true for okay, DA recently explained marital rape is almost impossible to pursue. Yeah, true. But I do find it is empowering, even just for the survivor to know that, actually in the United States, that this is against the law. I remember speaking to this one woman. She was a younger woman, maybe 25. She was from Egypt. And when I told her, about marital rape and that, that you can say no to your husband and that is considered a crime here in the United States, she was just like shocked by that. I remember her saying, she's like, oh my God. She's like, I'm going to tell my friends that. She's like, I mean, we're not going to report it or anything, but it's just good for us to know, she said, which I think is true. It's helpful to just know that there are protections here in the US around some of these things, even when it is their spouse. So I think we were talking about financial concerns, not having access to public benefits. That was true in Asha's case, right? Like even when she was in shelter, she didn't have, she didn't have any money. He had kept all her wedding jewelry, which was the main form of wealth that she had when she came here. And she didn't have a work permit, so she couldn't work legally, and she didn't have access to public benefits. Let's go through these last ones quickly. Concern for immigration consequences. We talked about how the survivor may be worried about immigration consequences for themselves. It's also true that the survivor might be worried about the consequences for their partner, right? We know that survivors often, they want the abuse to stop, but they may not necessarily want to get their partner in trouble, right? And in the case that where it's an immigrant survivor and an immigrant abuser, not only might this person go to jail, but they could be placed in removal proceedings. They could be deported back to, perhaps a dangerous situation in their home country, or back to a really bad economic situation where they are definitely not going to be able to provide any kind of financial support to the survivor or their children. So these are considerations that the survivor is thinking about when they're deciding what they might want to do, if they want to report or not. And they also might have concerns for, if they're living in a situation where there are other folks in the home who are undocumented or neighbors, they just might feel scared about bringing the police or reaching out for help when it might draw attention to other folks and potentially they fear put them at risk. And then lastly, we find that sometimes immigrant survivors are not as aware of shelter and services that may be available to them. In Asha's case, she had not heard of a domestic violence shelter back in Pakistan. So that was a kind of a unique thing for her. I've often had survivors who were kind of surprised about the existence of our services, of free immigration legal services, because it's not something that they had seen before. And so it's really on us to do the outreach so that folks know about our services and that we are that they are responsive to them and accessible to immigrant survivors. So if there are no questions on those two pieces, I did just want to, if Amanda, if you could launch the poll question. We just wanted to kind of gauge your experience. How many, I think the poll question should be how many immigrant survivors you see in your work. If it's, let me see if we have to open the poll or. Yeah, okay. So it's our second poll question, which is, how familiar are you with the immigration options for immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, which I just laid out some of them here, like the VAWA Self-Petition, the Battered Spouse Waiver, the UNT visa. Are these things that you've never heard of at all, you're not familiar with, you've kind of heard about them, or you're very familiar with these? And if you see on the left-hand side of your screen, I think you just have to click click polls, and then click vote, and it will come up for you there, and you can respond to the poll. So I'll give you guys a couple seconds to do that. Okay, so sorry, I'm just figuring out how to use this platform, and I see now that looks probably a lot of folks have already responded, and most folks are in that middle category of somewhat familiar. A couple of people are saying not familiar at all, so that's great. Obviously, probably that's why you're here at this training. If you were very familiar, you probably would not have bothered to come here at 8:45 in the morning. So I'm going to turn it over to Carla. She's going to walk us through some of the options, the immigration options that are available to survivors like Asha. And yeah, I'll turn it over to you, Carla.
Thank you, Sarah. So the first type of immigration relief that are available for immigrant survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault is called the VAWA Self-Petition. This is for survivors that are legally married to a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident, which is someone that has a 10-year green card. They need to show that they enter into the marriage in good faith and not for the purpose to obtain an immigration benefit. They also need to prove that they live with their abuser, experience abuse or extreme cruelty, and can demonstrate that they have good moral character. Sorry, you guys cannot hear me? Can you hear me, Sarah, well, or?
I can hear you. There is like a little bit of a background noise, but I can hear you. So it's somewhat hard to hear. I keep hearing an echo. Okay, they're going to leave and come back. We'll see. I can hear you though, Carla. Go ahead, continue.
Okay, Sarah, do you mind unmuting yourself to see if that helps? Maybe? It's better now? It's the same? Okay, should I continue? Can you hear me well, Sarah, or still okay? Okay. Okay, thank you. So the good faith marriage and shared residence requirements can be proven by providing, for example, a copy of a marriage certificate, children birth certificates born in the marriage, any document or correspondence addressed to both or either one of them, showing the marital address, photos together, Facebook post, etc. The abuse itself can be proven by providing copies of protection from abuse orders, police reports, criminal dockets, photos of physical injuries, photos of any property damages as a consequence of the abuse, support letters from a DBSA agency, medical records, and even support letters from witnesses. The good moral character factor can be proven by showing, for example, that the survivor doesn't have a criminal record in the United States or in their home country, and also with letters of support from family, friends, employer, a pastor, a school, etc., that is attesting to their good moral character. So some of the benefits, I see that someone is not hearing me well. Should I continue? Sorry, can you hear me well?
I can hear you. I mean, there's a little bit of a background noise. You know what? Try. It's like when I'm off mute and when I'm speaking, I don't hear the background noise. But when you're speaking, there is like this kind of hum in the background. I'm not sure if the host.
Well, I have a pen. I don't know if that's the issue. Let me turn it off.
Okay.
Is that better now?
I think it sounds a little bit better. I think it.
Still?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay, and okay. Okay, so the problem continues.
Oh, she said, please go on. Somebody said it sounds better, so I think it's okay.
Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you, guys. Okay. So some of the benefits of the VAWA self-petition is that they will be granted a prima facie determination, which will allow them to apply for a driver's license or a state ID. They will also be granted an employment authorization card and a social security card. Another benefit is deferred action, which means that they will be of low priority for deportation proceedings, and they can apply for permanent residency if they are eligible. If they become permanent residents, they will receive a green card that is valid for 10 years and will be able to apply for citizenship after 3 years of becoming a legal permanent resident. A survivor granted a VAWA is not eligible for permanent residency if, for example, the survivor made a false claim of US citizenship, because it is an inadmissibility factor that cannot be waived under VAWA, but can be waived under another type of relief called the U visa that we are going to discuss today. So the second type of relief is the Battered Spouse Waiver for conditional residents. This waiver is for conditional residents, which means that it's for survivors that have a green card only valid for 2 years. Like the VAWA self-petitioners, they need to prove that they enter into the marriage in good faith, share residence with the abuser, and experience abuse or extreme cruelty, which can be proven in the same way as the VAWA self-petition. Some of the benefits of this waiver is that it waives the joint filing requirement to have conditions lifted in order to obtain permanent residency, meaning that it can be filed without depending on the abusive spouse. It can be filed early, meaning that you do not need to wait for the 2-year green card to expire. And the waiver can be filed under other grounds other than abuse, such as divorce, death of a USC spouse, and extreme hardship. We can find a way to share all this information. I don't know if Helen can email that to you guys.
Carla, I don't know if it's also, I don't know if there's another issue on your end, but the slide is not advancing. Do you feel okay, or do you want me to jump in? I'm fine either way.
Okay, well, oh, I'm sorry, I see. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I will continue. Sorry, guys. Okay. So the third type of relief that we're going to discuss today is called the U visa, and this is, in my opinion, the most complicated one to work with and maybe to understand. So the U visa, for those of you who are not familiar with, is for victims of certain serious crimes that have occurred in the United States, such as domestic abuse, rape, sexual assault, kidnapping, torture, female genital mutilation, stalking, among others, who have helped or are willing to help law enforcement in the investigation or prosecution of the criminal activity. They need to show that they have suffered substantial mental or physical abuse as a result of that criminal activity and have full qualities sufficient for a waiver of any grounds of inadmissibility. An example of an inadmissibility factor that can be waived is the false claim of U.S. citizenship. The abuse can be proven, for example, with police reports, protection orders, photos of physical injuries, proof of psychological therapy, medical records, etc. The cooperation with law enforcement can be proven with the police report, testimony in court if the criminal charges have been filed, and by complying with any request from law enforcement throughout the investigation or prosecution of the crime. It's not a requirement for criminal charges to be filed against the perpetrator in order to qualify for the U visa, but what is required is the reporting of the crime and to obtain a certification signed by law enforcement confirming the report and cooperation. The certification can be signed, for example, by the federal, state, or local police, a PFA judge, or a district attorney, and it is valid for 6 months, meaning that the U visa application needs to be filed during that time. If the certification is not signed, the survivor doesn't qualify for the U visa. Law enforcement has absolute discretion to sign or not that certification, even if the survivor has fully cooperated, which is really unfortunate. And even if it is signed and the U visa is filed, law enforcement can withdraw the certification if the survivor stops cooperating in the case, and therefore the survivor will no longer be eligible for a U visa and the pending application will be denied. So that's very important to know. Something that I have learned throughout these years is that having a good relationship with advocates like you guys from the Victim Witness Assistance Program, for example, is extremely helpful to get the certification signed since they can approach law enforcement more directly. Another downside of this relief is the U visa cap, because only 10,000 U visas can be granted each year. And because the cap is reached every single year, USCIS has created a waiting list that allows the applicants to obtain a work authorization and defer action while the application is being adjudicated. However, because so many U visas are filed each year, it's taking around 4 years to enter into that waiting list from the day that the application was filed, meaning that survivors will unfortunately continue without any protection during that time. The new administration started issuing bona fide determinations to U visa applicants that in theory should allow them to get work authorization and defer action faster than the waiting list, but that determination is being issued in the order in which each application was received. And so far, I personally have seen that applicants that applied in or before 2016 are starting receiving it. Although the U visa is a very long process that could take up to 12 years and has many downsides, it has its benefits when the applicant has no other alternative. Some benefits are 4 years of non-immigrant status if the U visa is approved, 4 years of employment authorization in the United States. They will be eligible to apply for lawful permanent residency, meaning to obtain the green card after 3 years in EU non-immigrant status. And if they become legal permanent residents, they will be eligible to apply for US citizenship after 5 years of receiving the 10-year green card. They can also apply for derivatives such as non-perpetrator spouses, unmarried children under 21 years of age, parents and siblings of minor victims that are either living in the United States or living abroad, and they will receive the same benefits as the applicant. So that's the U visa. That was a lot of information. If you guys have any questions about the type of relief that we have discussed so far, the VAWA Self-Petition or the U visa, please feel free to type in your questions. So the last type of relief that we're going to discuss today is called the T visa. And the T visa is available for victims of victims of severe form of trafficking that can be either sex or labor trafficking. They need to prove that they are in the United States due to the trafficking and that they have been helpful in the investigation and or prosecution of the trafficking, that they will experience extreme hardship involving unusual and severe harm if they are removed from the United States. For example, that if they return to their home country, the trafficker could further harm them in their country. And they need to show that they are not inadmissible under immigration law, or at least eligible for a waiver. For example, if they made a false claim of U.S. citizenship, it is an inadmissibility issue that can be waived under the T visa as well as under the U visa that we discussed. So in the T visa, the law enforcement certification is not required, but it is very helpful to include in the application. And this is a huge difference between the U visa and the T visa, where in the U visa it is required. And if the survivor doesn't obtain the signed certification, cannot apply for the U. But in this case, can apply for the T. And the benefits of the T visa is 4 years of temporary legal status and employment authorization, the right to apply for legal permanent residence after 3 years, and the right to include derivative family members that are either living in the United States or abroad. And with that, we have concluded the discussion of some types of immigration relief that are available to immigrants, survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. If you have any question, again, please feel to continue typing it in the chat box, and we will continue answering them. So now Sarah will discuss. Yes, Sarah?
We did have one question in the chat about how long the wait list. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread the question actually. The question is, how long is the wait list for U visas currently? And I responded in the chat saying that at ISP, we are receiving deferred action notices or notices that someone's been placed on the wait list after for cases that have been filed about 4 to 5 years ago. And I'm not sure if that was the question, like how long does it take from the time of filing until they receive deferred action and work authorization, or if your question was how long might someone be on the wait list. Both are kind of depressing answers, but like I said, we're seeing right now conditional approvals or wait list notifications for folks that we filed for 4 to 5 years ago, and in some of those cases we've had to we've partnered with pro bono attorneys to actually sue the government to essentially force them into issuing a decision because it's taking so long. But if your question is also how long might someone be on the wait list, right? So recently we've had, and this is a little bit complicated, so I apologize if it's more information than you want, but we've had folks who get waitlisted, and then it's not so long of a wait for them to get their actual U visa. But as time goes on, that's probably less and less likely. There are, I can say, there, as Carla mentioned, there is a cap. So there's only 10,000 available each year. And I think right now there's something like 260,000 pending applications. So if, and I think the approval rate, I don't remember exactly if it's around 70 or 80%, but so if you do that math, you can see, that it's a lot of years of being on the wait list. And I think that will continue to be the case. Even Carla mentioned the bona fide EADs or employment authorization documents. We hope that will speed up the time, from the time you file until you get work authorization is going to be faster than it has been in the past, but that doesn't do anything to address the long time that you're going to spend on the wait list. And, while you're on the wait list, you will have deferred action, protection, or be low priority for deportation, and you will have work authorization. But it won't be until the visa becomes available for you and you receive your actual U that you'll be in that U status for 3 years, and then you're eligible to file for a green card. So it is a very, very long process for the U visa. But as Carla was mentioning, there is this really generous waiver. And so for some folks who are undocumented, crime victims, the U visa is the only option. So even though it does sound like not a great option because it takes so long, it's still better than nothing, and it is ultimately a path to a very secure immigration legal status in permanent residency. So yeah, and it's so important for those of you who are advocates and other people who are kind of first responders to know about these benefits and these options, because you may be the first person that someone is talking to. For example, someone calls into the hotline, and if you can even have this basic understanding of the U visa and tell them that there is this option out there, then they can make an informed decision about if they want to cooperate, because we talked about all those barriers to reporting and to cooperation, but really and of course it's going to be up to the survivor and it's going to be their own decision, but at least they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to cooperate or report. So if there aren't any other questions, I did also, I was thinking, I didn't want to jump in on Carla, but I wanted to mention, okay, I see one more question. I'm just going to say one thing and then I'll address that question. One thing that it's really important for advocates is that you can play a role in this process, right? So one, of course, you can connect the survivor to an immigration legal service provider, and also the letters that DVSA agencies provide in these cases are so valuable. So that's one way you can also help a survivor in this process, is providing a letter verifying that they are receiving services. That's something that USCIS really likes to see, and it can be super helpful. So I just wanted to mention that piece. What is not inadmissible under immigration law for the T visa? So Carla, do you want to respond, or it's okay? Okay. So inadmissibility, like this is like an immigration term of art, right? So basically there's a long list of things that would make somebody inadmissible. Could be things like immigration violations, like Carla was mentioning, a false claim to U.S. citizenship. That would be like if, you might have, say you bought like a Puerto Rican birth certificate, for example, and then you used that person's identity to apply for a job, which is something that people often, may have to do. That could be considered a false claim to U.S. citizenship, and that would make you inadmissible. It would mean you're not eligible to receive an immigration benefit. It could also be things like criminal issues. So there's a long list of crimes, and some are, even things that may not seem very serious, might be like a crime involving moral turpitude, or, there's just a long list basically of things that would make you inadmissible, like not eligible for an immigration benefit. And so what's great about the U and T visa is that there is this very generous waiver, where even if you entered the United States without inspection, or maybe you came on a visa and you overstayed, or maybe even you had a prior deportation, something like that. With the UNT visa, there is this generous waiver that would allow you to apply essentially for like a pardon, something like a pardon. where you would have to demonstrate that you, it's kind of a balancing act, like do you have enough positive equities, ties to the United States, maybe you've got US citizen children, you know, maybe you volunteer at your church, whatever. You want to show those positive equities and kind of balance them with whatever negative or whatever grounds of inadmissibility you might have. So I'm not sure, I hope that answers the question. But the main thing for you all to know is obviously, you know, you won't become an expert on immigration law in this quick, you know, training. But what we hope you'll know is that there are these forms of relief out there, specifically, you know, just keeping in mind those two categories, right? There's benefits. There are benefits for people who are married to someone with status, like someone who's married to a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident. And then there are these other benefits that are for victims of crime that cooperate with law enforcement. And if you just kind of keep those things in mind when you're working with someone, and connect them with an immigration legal service provider, you could really be, you know, doing a lot to help them establish a more secure immigration legal status, and which can do, you know, make a huge difference in someone's life. So we are going to, yeah, and feel free, like Julie, I think you're here in York. Feel free, like anytime, if you have any questions about a case that's involving immigration, or particularly for survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault, please feel welcome to call us. We are more than happy to talk it through with you. So, you know, please, and I know you mentioned that maybe some folks couldn't hear everything as Carla was presenting, but please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to talk it through with you. So I am going to talk about some of the best practices, some tips for working with immigrant survivors that we hope you will, as we're talking about these, think about your own agency, think about the things that you do well, the things that you could maybe work on a little bit, things that you could maybe change to make your services more responsive to the needs of immigrant survivors. The first one, you can go ahead to the next slide, Carla. The first thing, particularly if you're in a position, a management position, and you have any kind of power over hiring or even recruiting volunteers, this would be relevant. Looking at the staffing at your agency and making sure that you have the communities that you want to serve, that you have those communities also represented in your staff. And thinking about if you can prioritize hiring bilingual or and or bicultural staff. In my experience working with, I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of domestic violence and sexual assault agencies across the state. And one observation that I've made is that the programs that are most successful at serving immigrant survivors are those that have bilingual, bicultural staff. You know, ideally someone who has ties to the community there and someone who sticks around at the agency. That's just invaluable. You know, we have a coworker who joined PERC, but she was a longtime advocate at Safe Home in Hanover. And really, you know, the number of relationships that she had and people really just knew her and trusted her, and she was able to walk them through these processes and connect them for immigration legal services. And she, you know, she was able to change so many people's lives there. So I think, you know, if that can be prioritized, that's great. That's one of the most effective ways. Obviously, we're going to talk about language access, and it's important to, you know, provide interpretation and translation when you can. But really, if you have a bilingual advocate that's able to provide the service in the client's first language, that's you know, the best case scenario, right? It's just, we all know it's more comfortable to communicate in our first language, particularly when we're talking about something that's you know, traumatic or disclosing abuse and seeking help. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So similarly, you can also think about your actual physical space. I know a lot of us are now providing our services remotely. Maybe some of us, of course, are back in person. But thinking about your space, thinking about your materials that you have, what languages are they in, what do the folks look like in your materials, making sure, again, that they're really representative of everybody that you want to serve. You can go to the next. Language access obviously is a huge piece of the puzzle. And so I hope that you'll think about what your agency does currently. Hopefully if your agency has a language access plan. Unfortunately, what sometimes happens is that maybe an agency develops a language access plan because it's required by a funder, for example, but then it kind of sits around collecting dust, and we never go back and think about it again. We don't make sure that's incorporated into our new employee and volunteer onboarding to make sure everybody knows this is how you access telephonic interpretation, or this is how we determine what documents we translate and how we get that done. Sometimes people don't remember to go back and revisit it and think, is this still working for us? Are we serving, does our interpretation usage really reflect who's in our community? So it's really important to just not come up with that plan one time and then forget about it, but keep revisiting it and making sure that it's working. And also, I think, a lot of you are in a unique position to kind of also monitor what's going on with language access in other arenas, right? Like in the courts and in, with police and with other service providers, because we all generally, anyone who's receiving federal funds is required by Title VI to provide meaningful language access. So, you may have the opportunity to advocate on behalf of the survivor and ensure that they get the interpretation or translation services that they need. Like in Asha's case, if you're going to court with someone and you notice that they're not being provided interpretation services, you might be able to advocate on their behalf. Can go to the next one. In that same vein, you might have the opportunity to advocate for them on issues of language access. It's also really important to provide accompaniment and assist survivors in reporting for all of those reasons that we talked about earlier in the presentation, right? All the barriers that exist that someone has to overcome in addition to what all survivors are overcoming, right? When they decide to report and to cooperate in a criminal case. So anything that you can do to support the survivor in that, whether it's, going along with them to make a report or accompanying them to PFA proceedings or to criminal proceedings, even if you don't speak the same language as the person, just having someone there that they know is there for them and is on their side and is, kind of monitoring what's going on. If they have fears around immigration enforcement, it's really invaluable to have that support. And then it also helps you notice systemic things, like if you notice there are issues around, perhaps someone asking about immigration status, like law enforcement asking about immigration status, just something like that. You might have the opportunity to intervene or to do some advocacy, systemic advocacy, or advocacy on behalf of that one individual. So that's really, really critical, especially because Carla talked about how that cooperation is so important for the eligibility for the U visa. So any support that we can provide in making it easier for the survivor to cooperate is critical. Getting to know your local immigration legal service providers. So PERC provides free immigration legal services basically throughout the state. As I mentioned, we generally don't serve Philadelphia and the surrounding counties. So Philadelphia County, Bucks, Montgomery, Delaware, and Chester counties, because HIAS and NSC are also two longstanding immigration legal service providers that provide service there. But basically anywhere else in the state, you can refer to us, and we have a referral email, which I don't know actually that we included here in this PowerPoint, but feel free to email either Carla or myself, and we will forward the referral on or provide that to you. I can't say enough about how important it is to connect survivors with reputable, ideally nonprofit immigration legal service providers who really specialize in these forms of relief. And really now there are services available, no matter where the survivor is in Pennsylvania. So there's no reason that a survivor should have to pay for representation in a case, in a VAWA, U-Visa, Battered Spouse Waiver. And I want to caution that there are also, sometimes people who are trying to take advantage, sometimes people who are very well-meaning and they genuinely are trying to help, but it's so important that the survivor be connected with a licensed attorney or a Department of Justice accredited representative. The consequences in filing an application, or making mistakes in applications, or the consequences are too great. And it's really, really important. It's really hard to undo something, once it's been done and once mistakes have been made. So if you can get someone into good hands right away, obviously that's the best case scenario. And that's probably one of the most important roles that you can play for them in terms of their immigration status is connecting them with a reputable immigration legal service provider. Lastly, you want to make, okay, great. I hear someone saying already that they have someone that they want to refer. Please go ahead. You can either give us a call, you can have the client call us directly, or you can call us or email us, and we will, generally what we do is once we receive the referral, we do a phone intake with the survivor. We'll evaluate, determine what they're eligible for, if they're eligible for any form of relief, and then we talk about it in our team if we have to discuss if we have the capacity to take the case. And then right now we are working with folks primarily remotely. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, duh. Why didn't I think of that? We could put it in the chat. So we do have an email address that is for ISP referrals. So you can send it directly there, or you can reach out to Carla or myself. So lastly, one of the important things I want to mention in terms of working with immigrant survivors is the importance of making warm referrals. We know that many times survivors are coming to you, maybe for the DV or SA, but they also have other needs. They also have other stuff going on. And one of the big things that we do is provide referrals. When you're working with someone who might be a limited English proficient survivor, an immigrant survivor, you want to really think through your referrals, right? And you want to, if you can, if it's at all possible, make a warm handoff to somebody that you know or that you trust at that other referral agency. Or you might just take the extra minute to sit down and call with the survivor there, rather than just handing them a phone number, if they need a clothing bank or something. If you hand somebody a phone number and they're going to call and they're going to go through 12 prompts in English, or they're going to go somewhere and they're going to be asked for their social security number, it might not really be an effective referral. So really just taking the extra minute to sit down and make that call with them might be really beneficial to an immigrant survivor. So we hope, and we know this was a ton of information, but we hope that you will think through, kind of do a little bit of reflection. If this gives you the opportunity to do that, maybe talk with supervisors or managers, or with your staff if you are a supervisor or manager, and think through how your agency is doing currently, what you could be doing better. Certainly, if there are any ways that we can support you in better serving immigrant survivors, we would love to do that. If you are a domestic violence or sexual assault agency that is kind of like a member agency of PCDB or PCAR, and you're not already participating in the Immigrant Survivors Advocate Network, you can reach out to us about that. Again, the network provides, you can make referrals for immigration legal services, provides document translation, interpretation, training, technical assistance. Like I know, for example, we've got a training coming up in December around immigrant survivor eligibility for public housing. We often do trainings like that are specific. We just did one a month ago on like healthcare eligibility, healthcare benefit eligibility for immigrant survivors. So we do things like that. We also have a resource bank that anyone can access. Carla, if you can put our website in the chat. If you go to the website and you click on programs and then Immigrant Survivors Advocate Network, you'll see there a link to a resource bank that it has like these posters that are behind me. Actually, you can download those, you can print those. There's like language identification posters that will let somebody know, you have the right to an interpreter. Just tons of different, there are these really nice visual safety plans that are available in like 10 languages. There's also like a lot of the PCCD documents, like even the booklet that goes through like crime victims' rights, crime victims' bill of rights, the VOCA ESQ survey. Those things are all in there in usually like 10 or 11 languages. There's also like a general consent to release information form that you can edit to make to be for your agency that's on there in 10 languages. So if you're looking for something, you can go there and check and see if we have it, or if there's other things that you'd like to see there, just let me know. But if there are not any additional questions, Carla, if you can go to the last slide that I think has our email addresses on it. We talked through ESUN in the beginning. Please feel free, like I said, we are more than happy to assist in any way that we can, providing information, or if you'd like to make a referral, please feel free to email either one of us. And yeah, I think that's all we have for you today, unless there are any lingering questions. It doesn't look like it. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email us. And I think that's it. Thank you guys so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.